Okay, my watch says 1:15. Does anyone disagree? Good. Hi, everybody. My name's Pam Dingle. I work for Ping in the office of the CTO. And we have a track today with 3 different sessions, all based around API-driven topics. So you're going to start with, we're starting with one that's specifically around identity-based APIs and why we need them and what they're for and what works and what doesn't. The second one, there's much more API philosophy, talking about all of your APIs rather than just the identity ones. And then our third is a deeper dive into, from someone who has really worked integrating APIs and can tell you in detail what the flows look like, why you should care, and how the mechanisms actually operate. So we're sort of starting general, and we're getting deeper as the track goes on. So I get to start. I'm also moderating the session. So what that means is there's nobody here to pull me off stage. There's no oversight. I can just do whatever I want. And I'm a little power drunk, but I'm going to go for it anyway. So we'll see how it all goes. So yes, and I am Pamela Rosie D on Twitter. If you want to follow me, that's the best way generally to heckle and or make fun. So please go right ahead. So with that, we'll get started here. All right, who knows what this is? Tribble. This is a Tribble. So does everyone know what Tribbles are? Is there anyone here for whom a Tribble is an odd thing? Okay, so let's talk about Tribbles. Tribbles are cute, tiny, lovely little creatures that are wonderful. They're nice. They make you feel good. It solves a problem, that you're having. At the end of the day, they're wonderful. They get you where you need to go from an emotional perspective. But there's a small little thing about Tribbles that nobody really realizes at the beginning. And that is that Tribbles proliferate. And when they proliferate, they grow, and more of them tend to attach themselves. And all of a sudden, everything's wrecked, right? You can't do anything. You are beholden to these creatures that you thought were actually serving your business, right? So I believe that provisioning connectors are like Tribbles. So if you think of the problem that you have of actually trying to push authoritative data about your people, about their status, their position in your organization, out to applications so that the applications can make timely access decisions so that your audit and compliance schedules actually work. A lot of times what you end up doing is fixing the glitch, right? Fixing the glitch. I need data. I have data here. I need to get data there. I'm going to buy a connector. I'm going to buy a thing that says provisioning for application X. And I'm going to insert that or check it off or buy it or sign a check, and my problem goes away. However, this is a problem that does not work well at scale. So if you have 1,000 connectors, each running 1,000 different pieces of code, then the question of maintainability starts to become a really a big, glaring, obvious risk in your enterprise. And so my hypothesis here, my assertion to you is that connectors are trouble. Connectors have issues that we need to solve. So if you think about what it means to move identity data between systems, there's really 3 things that have traditionally happened in enterprises, right? How many people here are actually using provisioning tools of some kind today? Okay, so not even half the room, I would say. Maybe 30% of the room is today. So here's the traditional rundown of a cloud provisioning tool. What you do is you, at all costs, bypass the application. That is what most provisioning tools do. And the reason that most provisioning tools do that is because applications are written as if they are the whole, soul, and center sun in the universe, right? They write, when you write an application, the first thing you have to do is satisfy a standalone condition. And that standalone condition, right, the MVP of applications when it comes to identity is you have to have a login page, right? You have to have usernames and passwords, and you have to have an admin console where a human being can type in the names of the users of the system, right? That is the absolute bare minimum, and many applications do no more than that. So what happens is, if you're within a network perimeter and you have control over the data layer, the first thing that you do is you buy tools that will push things into the data layer as if they had been inserted via the application, right? Now there's problems with this, like for example, you bypass all of the authorization, all of the application logic, right? You have to basically emulate all of the form submission data, logic that would have happened if you typed it into an administrative console. You have to replicate that and enforce that somewhere else. But what happens is the application starts up, and it reads its user database, and what do you know? There's one more user in the database. The application doesn't care, right? It's stateless, generally speaking. It's going to consume that user, right? As if it had always been there, as if it had been inserted from the actual product. So it's a game of compensation that gets played in the provisioning world on premise. And you know, there are lots of mitigations to make this less onerous, right? You don't have to necessarily push into every single application database, because some applications are smart enough to use a centralized set of infrastructure. So for example, applications would perhaps call out to a directory like LDAP in order to validate users and query for attributes, rather than, you know, strictly operating in their sad, siloed little world. So these are the three primary tools that have existed historically for cloud provisioning, which is great. But we're here to talk about cloud provisioning, right? And cloud provisioning, we're in not quite as good a state because we don't have access to the database layer. So we can't just punt things into new records in Oracle databases and have the application just obliviously load up a user who wasn't there a second ago. However, we do have a couple of other really cool tricks up our sleeve. We can still depend on externalized infrastructure, and we can do that via federation, right? So there is a concept called just-in-time provisioning, which works pretty well, with a few caveats, where you can SSO over to an application, and if the application is smart, even if they don't recognize the user, they can validate the SAML assertion, right, and say, well, okay, I don't know who this user is, but the enterprise, right, is telling me that this is a user who should be in the app, so I'm just going to create that user now, right? So just-in-time provisioning is valuable, especially in cases like partner portals, for example, where you could have anywhere between 1 and 1,000 different members of a given partner company come in, and you certainly don't want to be spending overhead inserting those people into the application in advance, right? You just want to know that if they get there, then boom, they're in the product, they're in the app, they're allowed, life is good. And the cool thing about that is if an application implements any kind of provisioning logic, then you have solved the problem of bypassing the application's workflow, right? The application's policies, right? Because you know that if the application is going to write this logic in, it's going to write it in and test it with its own use cases. So you may still want to externalize policy, and lots of people choose to create generic policies or corporate umbrella policies and enforce them outside of an application. But it's really nice to know that at least what you have within that application operates properly, and that you're not inserting data that's actually going to cause glitches or anomalies later on. And then there's the API. So you obviously don't have access. You're not going to be making any JDBC. There's no SQL calls that are going to be going on. So what has to happen is the application has to open an interface in order for you to be able to push identities in or pull identities out, right? And that API these days tends to be REST-based. But what does it look like? Well, it all depends. So if you're familiar with Conway's law, Conway's law says that your software architecture tends to directly reflect your organizational structure. So what that means is that the devs will write the thing that makes sense to them according to the context that they are in. That is not the context of any of their customers necessarily. It is the context of, developers with deadlines and existing data models, right? So Conway's law sort of says that everything's going to be a little different because everyone interprets it differently and everyone's got a different structure that they're working from. And this is problematic. Oh, my fonts didn't line up properly. This is problematic because the bottom line is, if you're familiar with Tesler's law of complexity, the bottom line is there's a fixed amount of complexity that exists between having identity and wanting identity and moving the identity across, right? You have to do certain things, or something has to execute certain tasks. The question is, where does that burden of complexity lie? Does it lie on the API design or the API developers? Does it lie at the enterprise? Thank you, right? Or is it somewhere in between? Is something else going to compensate, right? That's the problem we have, and this is how we solve it today, right? This is a provisioning connector, okay? It is a piece that sits in the middle that theoretically you can buy, right? That absorbs the complexity, that figures out your mappings of your identities in your directory in probably a different domain, and the organizational chaos barely represented by an API that your SaaS app might actually have advertised, right? And again, the trouble with Tribbles are that they're fine by themselves and they're horrible at scale. So you have this thing that requires care and maintenance, and maybe it's not you, right? Maybe it's not you that actually has to care for and maintain this thing, but it's somebody else who does. And I will say this, as a vendor, we have a fixed amount of resources, right? We can only solve a fixed number of problems, and the bigger these things are, the fewer of them we can make and maintain. And so what happens in our industry is that there are big Tribbles and there are no Tribbles, right? There's only a certain set of things that we have time to make, and because these things are so time-consuming and miserable to maintain, it simply reduces the number of connectors on the market available for people to purchase. So whether you're making it or building it or whether you're buying it, this complexity, the fact that you have to build the whole thing from scratch and understand the complex data models behind from scratch, it costs people money and it costs everyone time. So here's the Kool-Aid slide, right, which is, what if we could use standards to absorb the complexity? What if there was a standardized SCIM client that could be built once, tested once, maintained once, that could be used as the bulk of every single one of your provisioning connections? Well, if you do that, then there is a small burden of complexity now that moves over to the people who maintain the API, because they have to do the work now to map their data model with all its messy happiness to an actual standardized model. Okay, so there's a little bit of effort there. However, Tesler's law says that that one action of those developers, they can take one action, right, that's a little bit complex for them and reduce untold amounts of complexity for every one of their customers. So that's the value, right? The value for the cloud applications on that side is that they work it once, they make everybody happy, right? They have an answer for every single customer who comes to them. However, there's still a little Tribble there because everybody's different. You're doing different things with those APIs, right? But look how cute it is. It's just a little itty-bitty Tribble. Okay, it's a Tribble. And lots of people sit here and say, all right, if you're going to make some of it custom, well, then it's blown the whole thing. Why don't you just write it all custom, right? You can't have it 80% custom or 80% standardized and then have a little bit of custom. You still have to do all the work. Well, that is true. However, people have solved this problem, okay? People have solved this problem. You cannot tell me that if, people who deploy elastic environments right, that are highly complex, that involve machines with memory and disk and evolving circumstances, right? If they can actually standardize and elastically stand up and sit down and do all these somersaults with servers, you can't tell me that we can't handle a few extra custom attributes. What we need are recipes, right? That is what a standard is, right? We have, if you look at the SCIM standard, so SCIM stands for System for Cross-Domain Authentication. What it is a recipe. It has ingredients, it has instructions, right? Here's what's in it, and here's how you use it. But it's just a base recipe. It's like the base blueberry muffin recipe, right? It doesn't mean you can't add walnuts. It just means that you have to think for yourself a little bit, right? And experiment and get it right, okay? However, right now, you know, SCIM, there's not a lot of conversation about what it means to automate a new recipe on top of SCIM. But I think everyone here can see that it's kind of important, right? There is no doubt of where we're going as an industry, and that is full and absolute automation. People will be incented to figure out how to consume that little tiny shim of SCIM schema, parse it, understand it, apply it to their business model, right, and make it all work. Okay, if enterprises don't want to do it, vendors certainly will. Okay, and this model for a vendor is beautiful because they can still use that 80% SCIM client as the base, and then they can figure out what it means to deal with the extra little bits, but do it in an automated fashion because you're publishing the schema of the extra core attributes of your service. So the bottom line is, what we have to do is get to the point where when things are common, we automate it, right? When things are common, when you know you have to move data, then use the common concept of an identifier. Use the common concept of error codes that mean this identifier was not found, right? Use the common concepts of what is a first name, of what is a last name. Okay? The reason this presentation is called Snowflake as a Service is because right now, all of these cloud applications are writing all of their provisioning APIs separately, in isolation, made up from scratch, and the entire industry is scrambling to keep up. So if we can convince folks to go for that 80% SCIM client bar and to publish what's different in a way that's consumable, right, by an automated client, then we have now set the foundation for some really, really interesting things. Now, this all sounds great. I mean, this sounds very geeky and very technical, right? Okay, we're going to take an identifier from here. We're going to move it over to here, right? It's LDAP, right? Is it LDAP? Is it attributes? Maybe. Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. I think that this matters for a very specific reason, and that is that provisioning is only step one, right? Provisioning is the obvious, geeky, accounting basic that you have to have. But that's not actually the thing that's going to be interesting in our industry in the next 3 to 5 years, right? Yes, absolutely. What's happening right now is people are not so much calling their APIs provisioning APIs. They're calling them directory APIs. It's a very subtle difference, right? A directory API implies that you are opening up your data layer, right? It implies that it's, you know, JDBC 3.0 or whatever you want to call it, right? That you're just taking the data you have and synchronizing it with the data in the application, one-to-one, pushing it across, right? And that's great. That's useful. And the great thing about SCIM as a directory API is that it's simple. It doesn't try to boil the ocean. And various other protocols have tried to boil the ocean. However, I would ask you this. Is it not also true that provisioning is the very first out-of-band collaborative agreement between two domains, right? You can think of a new user created as a directory create, or you can think of it as an event that has occurred. A user has been created, okay? I think that's really important to think of it as an event, because events have significance, not just to a directory or a database. Events have significance as essentially a ripple effect through your whole application, right? Someone has been created. Oh, how does that affect our security posture? Someone has been created. Oh, where did they come from, right? Someone has been created. Oh, are they on a trusted device? Thank you, right? All of these questions, right? An event is a bigger thing than an LDAP bind or an LDAP search or an LDAP create. And I think we need to recognize this because there are new events that are going to be exciting to share that may or may not use this as a model, right? So example, perfect example, device posture. When you log into an application, your IDP has a device posture they know, right? So does your SP. How can they collaborate on those two things to say, hey, wait a minute, I think they're coming from British Columbia, and this other guy thinks they're coming from Argentina. Maybe there's an issue here, right? So if you think of this as signals, as systems talking to each other outside of the usual authentication flow, right? Then you start talking about session management. Then you start talking about account events like takeovers. All these things start to fall into place as the same, events of a same genre. And it gets really interesting. We have a basis for a conversation. So that's what I've got. We've got a little bit of time for questions. I did want to dedicate this presentation to my wonderful coworker, Paul Madsen, who inspires me so. And so that would be his face on William Shatner, in case any of you were wondering. Any questions?
So commonalities and standards are all wonderful, but of course the question for something like this is always, what is this going to do to the triple breeding and farming industries?
The triple breeding and farming industry. So the question was that standards are great, but what is the impact on the triple breeding and farming industry? So yes, so a lot of companies make money off of connectors, but the opportunity in identity right now is massive. And at least I can't really even speak on behalf of Ping, to be honest, but we have limited resources. We would much rather put into things like, additional intelligence or, additional development portals. I mean, there's a million things that we can choose to sell, and connectors is something that should just not be. And well, I was going to say it should not be one of them, but the truth is we can still sell them. We just put less work into them, and in theory, that price filters down to you. In theory, so you should, you may still want to buy a connector because it may still be nice to have a vendor discover all that extra bit and package it up in a pretty little picture, right? So I don't think that industry is going away. I just think that it serves everybody to either have more connectors or no connectors. Anyone?
I guess we deal with probably 2 SaaS vendors a month, probably on average. And for the last year, maybe year and a half, after we get past the sample question, the next question is, do you support any synchronized provision?
Right.
So far, I've had one come up who knew about SCIM.
Right.
And I heard earlier in one of the earlier presentations, well, okay, you're a commander. Yeah, not ready.
Yeah. If you can't satisfy it, then. It's a good question. So the question was, a lot of the vendors haven't even heard of SCIM, and even if the enterprises were to demand SCIM, they're demanding something that even they are not necessarily equipped to implement, right? Yeah, that's a problem. I mean, it's a fax machine problem that we have right now. But here's the thing about SCIM. SCIM is just an API, right? So if they're going to write an API, all SCIM does is gives them some patterns, right? Here's what you should name your attributes. Here's what your interfaces should look like. So if you can have that kind of conversation with vendors, you can say, look, you're going to write it anyway, right? Here are the 5 things you just need to do, and you'll be future-proofed when people come to you to ask for SCIM. So I do think that there are different qualities of conversations you can have. But yeah, I agree, it's a problem. I only probably have to hook myself here. One more, and then we'll.
Yeah. So even some of the large known vendors that support SCIM, their traditional API is
So the question was, Skim 1.1 was sparse, and there was a lot of delta on what different APIs could handle. Will Skim 2 help? I do think it does. If it all depends on the way it was sparse. So what Skim 2.0 will do is better specify what's there. But it doesn't necessarily expand the amount of attributes they cover, for example. So there are various people in this room and around this place that will give you different answers to that or more passionate answers to that. So I would encourage you to ask people like Ian Glazer or Justin Richer that same question. You'll get other answers. So okay, so now I have to play moderator here. Excuse me for 1 second. All right. Oh, thank you. Right. All right, we need to get Chris mic'd up here. So I'm going to give away my mic, and I'm going to yell my introduction so that we can stay on schedule. Okay. Oh, turn it off. Yeah.
And this is the moderator mic.
Oh, yeah,
right?
correct. Aha, I am mic'd after all. All right. Come on in, everybody. Find your seat. Walk out, whatever you need to do.